Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to start. If I could request everyone to find a seat and be comfortable, we're going to be starting in the next 2 minutes or so. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. We are a few minutes late, but welcome. That is my job. That is what I'm supposed to do. I'd like to welcome the governors that are here from our region, mainly from the Common Monetary Area region. The speakers, I understand you had a good speakers dinner last night, and participants from the private sector. And we have also decided to make this open, so there are members of the media here. And that's because this is an area that had generated a lot of interest in South Africa. But it's said to me that it's a great honor to have so many of distinguished guests join us here in Cape Town for the SAPS 2025 Biennial Research Conference. In particular, I would like to also welcome my colleagues, the deputy governors and members of the MPC that are here present. The conference comes as the South African Reserve Bank celebrates the silver jubilee of its inflation targeting framework. Back in 2000, South Africa was considered ahead of the curve, joining only a dozen or so countries that had implemented the framework. Motives for adopting inflation targeting varied. Some countries sought to shore up credibility in fighting inflation in response to rising exchange rate volatility. Others introduced inflation targeting because of problems experienced with the targeting of monetary aggregates. As the 7th governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Dr. Kristals, said when he was asked whether the South African Reserve Bank has abandoned monetary aggregates targeting, he retorted, "No, we didn't. Monetary aggregates abandoned us." For South Africa, the choice of implementing inflation targeting was considered prudent after the large cost and lack of transparency of the SAP's previous eclectic approach to monetary policy. But it also came in the aftermath of the 1998 rand depreciation, during which period we also blew the little reserves that we had, and we ramped up a massive oversold dollar forward position to the tune of some $26 billion. It was not a nice place to be in, and the current head of the Financial Markets Department, Zafar Parker, who is here with us in 1998, he was an intern in the Reserve Bank, and I am not even sure he knew what was going on at that particular time. And today he will tell you what a futile exercise it is to try and intervene in the foreign exchange market to try and shore up the currency. The inflation targeting framework has served us well. Since its adoption in 2000, the South African economy has experienced lower inflation. As a result, we enjoy much lower interest rates. Back in 1998, the repurchase rate was above 20%. Today, the repurchase rate is just 7.5%, which is higher than the lows experienced during the pandemic, of course, but well below the averages of the previous decades. Inflation targeting has also reduced macroeconomic volatility, enabling the economy to better weather the severe economic shocks and crises of recent times, including the 2008 Great Financial Crisis or the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. The benefits of inflation targeting have made it a popular framework for central banks, and the framework has become a global monetary standard, or as our keynote speaker, Claudio Borio, will discuss. However, inflation targeting continues to be challenged, with central banks facing various competing demands, including faster economic growth and greater responsibility for financial stability. These have once again come to the fore for both advanced economies, which we will discuss in session 2, as well as emerging markets, which will be detailed in the third session. One particular issue that both advanced and emerging market economies grapple with is making sure that their targets are efficient and fit and good, and useful definitions of price stability are identified. Most advanced economies have settled on maintaining inflation targets at 2%, while emerging markets are closer to the 3% mark. Early adopters of inflation targeting have updated their frameworks to better reflect changing realities on the ground, with Armenia being the latest central bank to also reduce its target to 3%. In this respect, the South African target is now rather dated, reducing our competitiveness and opportunity to generate faster and more sustainable growth. In session 4, we will have the opportunity to discuss what a more optimal inflation target for South Africa may look like, especially in the context of structural rigidities. We are excited to have conversations with prominent thought leaders in the field who will be also able to reflect on these and other issues facing inflation targeting central banks. Open discussions like these are important for how we think about the trajectory for global macroeconomic policy over the medium term and what that means for the path of inflation targeting within the South African context. In my many years in public service, I have come to think of inflation targeting much like Winston Churchill's viewed democracy. It is the worst form of governance except for all others. Research conferences like this should at least bring us closer to learning from our mistakes, and my hope is that we walk away with a few much-needed lessons for the future. In closing, I'd like to once again thank you for joining us for these important conversations. I look forward to engaging with all of you during the course of today and tomorrow. You have heard my own views expressed in a number of speeches that I had delivered, and you have also heard from various officials of the South African Reserve Bank expressing views. Today, I am not here to express my views. There are a lot of people who know a lot about this subject. I am here to listen and hope that South Africans would allow themselves to have a mirror shined on us so that we can reflect and see what the discourse is around the world and walk away from that South African drawback which says, don't confuse us with your facts. In monetary policy, as in other aspects, areas of economic policy, it is fine to express your views and hold your views dearly. What is clear is you are not entitled to your own facts. So let us have the discourse over the next 1.5 days. And once again, welcome. I will now hand over to the head of economic research and our chief economist, Chris Lowald, to chair the next session.
Okay, thank you very much, Governor, for kicking us off. I hope we've got Claudio online and ready to go. I won't really do much of an introduction. I think many of you know Claudio. He's been working at the Bank for International Settlements for many, many years, and for a very long time was the head of the Monetary and Economics Department, and has recently retired, which gives us the great benefit of being able to invite him to join us, hopefully in a more regular way, to talk about monetary policy. Today he's going to give us his keynote address, talking about inflation targeting as a global monetary standard, something that he has spent some time in recent months reflecting on and talking about around the world, and so we've got the benefit of having him here as well to kick us off with that address. So, Claudio, over to you. There we are.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be with you in person because of some personal issues. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here and to talk about an issue which has been close to my heart for many years, in fact, for a long part of my professional career. So what I thought I would try to do today is to provide some really personal reflections on the question of on the issue of inflation targeting. Of course, there are quite a number of similarities with the BIS views, given my role in the institution. A couple of years ago, we wrote a chapter in the, actually last year, in the annual economic report, which was devoted to an overview of monetary policy over the last 40 years or so. So if you're interested in the BIS institutional view, despite similarities, I would strongly suggest that you have a look at that chapter. So what I'd like to do is to stand back, therefore, and to provide some personal perspective on the success and limitations of what has become the de facto global monetary standard, that is inflation targeting. And basically, I would say two key takeaways from my presentation. The first is that inflation targeting has clearly achieved what it was designed to achieve, that is to help deliver an era of price stability. And that's, of course, is no mean feat, given that price stability is a precondition for prosperity. However, I do worry that to be fit for purpose longer term, it needs to adapt in ways that do not really figure prominently in current debates. And by that, I mean a more systematic consideration of the long-term damage that financial factors can create for the economy, more systematic consideration of the importance of safety margins in the operation of policy, and all this grounded in a realistic view of what monetary policy can and cannot deliver. So the roadmap of my presentation, I will briefly recall, if you like, the success story, which is probably the more uncontroversial part. Then I will turn to the limitations of the framework, which is the more controversial part. And then I will propose some refinements. Now, I prefer not to show graphs during presentation and just speak, but what I will be delivering is effectively a lecture that I gave some time ago, and you can actually look at the graphs that will substantiate the various points that I will be making, which of course are based on research that I have carried out over 30 years or so. Okay, first of all, I think we need to define the inflation targeting regime. And here I would define it as having three key features. The first is numerical targets for inflation. The second is doing away with intermediate targets, monetary targets or the exchange rates. And finally, a supporting communication strategy to strengthen transparency and accountability. Now, looking back, inflation targeting had a rather hesitant and inauspicious beginning because it was adopted initially, at least in countries that had tried everything else and had failed. Thinking, for example, of New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. You could say, if you wanted to be quite strong about this, and rather almost in desperation. Moreover, compared with the intermediate targeting strategies that it replaced, it represented a certain leap of faith. Until then, I recall very, very clearly as I was studying at university, the issue was how to achieve a given objective, given the sort of tenuous relationship or a possibly unstable relationship link between instruments and goals, the so-called control problem. Inflation targeting, in contrast to monetary targeting or an exchange rate peg, was rather silent about these issues. He basically said, well, let me control the interest rate, a very, very short-term interest rate, and through this, I will ultimately achieve inflation directly without having to go through any other particular anchor. Now, prima facie, you could say, it smacked a little bit of a case of if you cannot will the means, will the end. Now, despite this inauspicious start, inflation targeting has gone from strength to strength, as we know. It has been adopted widely across the world, and it has passed what I would call the defining no regret test. That is, no countries that has adopted the regime has actually dropped it. And judged on its explicit objective, it has been a success story. Inflation has generally been stable across the world, and the regime has coped with a surprising recent surge in inflation quite well. Now, to be sure, circumstances did help, and I will say more about this in a minute. But the role of inflation targeting in hardwiring a low inflation regime, I think, is undeniable. But what about the challenges that inflation targeting has faced? And I think here the key question is to what extent these challenges are exogenous to the regime, or to some extent the result of how the regime was operated. And I think forming a view about this question is essential in order to identify possible refinements. Now, my thesis is that some of the challenges that the IT regime faced are in part, the result of the specific operation of the regime. And I will focus on two challenges: the great financial crisis and the difficulties in pushing inflation back to point targets following the great financial crisis. Now, connecting these challenges is the historic loss in the room for policy maneuver. And monetary policy had suffered already before the COVID-19 crisis struck. In nominal terms, we know interest rates had never been so low, even hovering in negative territory. In real terms, they had been negative for even longer than what they had been during the great inflation era. And central bank balance sheets had reached peaks previously approximated only during wars. The COVID-19 crisis simply exacerbated these tendencies. And let me say a word about each of these two challenges and how to connect the two. So first of all, a few words about the pre-Great Financial Crisis phase. When inflation targeting was first adopted, people worried whether it would survive negative supply side shocks, because these tend to push inflation up, output down, creating the biggest challenges for policy. Instead, actually, I was more concerned with threats coming from the financial side, financial instability, and in that context, about positive, not negative, but positive supply side shocks, or better put, I think positive supply side forces. So why my concern? Well, as inflation targeting spread, the economic landscape was fundamentally changing in the wake of policy-induced tectonic forces. So on the one hand, financial liberalization was providing bigger scope for disruptive financial expansions and contractions, what I call financial cycles. And by financial cycles, I mean more precisely the self-reinforcing shifts in credit, asset prices, particularly property prices, with expansions that tend to generate following contractions. On the other hand, the globalization of the real side of the economy, the positive supply side force, had started blowing powerful disinflationary tailwinds. Think of the integration of former communist countries and China into the world trade and the opening up of emerging market economies, which was adding a huge number of lower cost workers to the world's effective labor force, transforming the wage price nexus, which is at the heart of inflation. So in that context, in that specific context, an inflation targeting regime could inadvertently accommodate the buildup of financial imbalances, because there would be no incentive to tighten as long as inflation remained under control, especially since inflation targeting dispensed with any role for monetary or credit aggregates. Indeed, if you look at the data carefully, a subtle change in the nature of the business cycle was taking place roughly from the mid-1980s, from what I would call inflation-induced to financial cycle-induced recessions, particularly in advanced economies, and this was therefore spreading recessions around the world. Now, until then, the typical trigger for a downturn was a monetary policy tightening to quell inflation. And in the meantime, indicators of the financial cycle were not really doing that much. Thereafter, inflation would not increase much. Monetary policy would have to tighten less, but large expansions, financial expansions, would turn into contractions. And of course, the great financial crisis is the most spectacular example, but even qualitative, at least, showing such features. Of course, we had full-blown financial crisis in Japan and in the Nordic countries, and of course, serious banking strains in the United States itself. So put differently, inflation became an unreliable signal of the sustainability of economic expansions, and it was the buildup of financial imbalances that was taking over that role. Now, importantly, the unreliability of inflation as a signal of this sustainability of the expansions was actually transmitting to the so-called natural interest rate, or R*, precisely at the time, of course, in which R* was increasing, was becoming more prominent in policy making, because intermediate targets, monetary targets, had been abandoned, or exchange rate pegs had been abandoned. By R*, I think we all know, we mean the short-term real interest rate, which is consistent with output at potential and stable inflation, ideally at target, absent business cycle disturbances, that is in steady state. So it became common practice at the time, as inflation was not rising as expected and was falling, to raise estimates of potential output, and therefore to lower estimates of R*, so as to keep the monetary policy on track. Now you can see how this over successive business and financial cycles could actually result in a reduction in interest rates over time, real interest rates over time. Because interest rates fall, they tend to lead to the buildup of financial imbalances, which after the bust necessitate lower real interest rates and nominal interest rates in order to deal with the aftermath of the indebtedness and to allow the reallocation of capital, particularly from real estate sectors to the rest of the economy. As the economy struggles and to absorb the debt overhang and the capital misallocation. So you could say that low interest rates in this specific context, historical context, beget lower interest rates. So what about the post-GFC phase? Well, here what I worry in particular is that over-reliance on the concept of R-star could further reduce the room for policy maneuver. And paradoxically, this would be the result of attempts to regain that policy room. And this was indeed a key consideration in the review of policy frameworks. Here, the notion that R-star is exogenous to monetary policy is absolutely key. Because if the real interest rate is exogenous, then the only way to regain room for policy maneuver on a durable basis is to raise inflation, of course. That is, to reduce inflation now in order to be able to reduce interest rates now to raise inflation tomorrow, which actually means losing room for maneuver for certain today in the expectation of gaining it tomorrow. But you can see that there is a risk here, because if inflation does not respond as expected, as envisaged, then central banks, in the process of trying to regain room for policy maneuver, would actually lose this policy room. And as it turned out, we know that central banks did struggle to push inflation back to point targets, even as economies recovered. Although shortfalls, we should bear in mind, never were particularly large. They remained contained within a handful of basis points. Moreover, concerns about the de-anchoring of expectations and ultimately deflation provided an additional reason to push harder. Now, there are at least two reasons in my mind why central banks struggled. The first is that the impact of easing on aggregate demand may exhibit diminishing returns after a certain point. After all, ultimately, monetary policy operates by bringing aggregate demand from the future to today. And there are clearly certain limits, there must be limits to this process. Moreover, interest rates that remain low for long can also sap bank profitability and banks' credit granting capacity. Here we're talking about nominal interest rates. And there is considerable evidence to this effect. The second reason, and this is probably an even more important reason, is that inflation may respond less to aggregate demand pressures when it settles at a low level. One possible explanation, which is specific to this historical period, is that the globalization tailwinds that were helping central banks as they were trying to keep inflation lower, bringing it down, were actually making it harder for them to achieve their objective, raising inflation during this phase. Now, the other reason, and let me dwell on this because I think it's particularly important, is that this may indeed be an inherent property of inflation when inflation is evolving in a low inflation regime. Now, recent work with colleagues has confirmed that inflation behaves very differently in low and high inflation regimes. In a low inflation regime, inflation exhibits self-stabilizing properties, significant self-stabilizing properties. What we measure as inflation is in fact the result of largely idiosyncratic or sector-specific price changes that tend to leave a limited impact on inflation itself. That is, another way of putting this is that the common component of inflation is actually quite low. In addition, we know that wages and prices are only loosely linked when inflation settles at a low level. Now, probably the key behavioral reason for this is that when inflation is low, it does not materially influence people's behavior. Economic agents, labor and firms become what some economists have called rationally inattentive. And I will say a few words about this later on. Now, by contrast, in a high inflation regime, there are no such self-stabilizing properties at work. The common component of inflation is considerably higher, and wages and prices are much more closely linked. So that shocks that are sector-specific can easily turn and become embedded into inflation. Now, critically, the small component of price changes, this small common component of price changes, reduces the responsiveness of inflation to adjustments in the monetary policy stance, because intuitively, changes in the stance work precisely through that component, the common component, which is more closely tied to aggregate demand than to exchange rates. And there is indeed quite a bit of evidence that confirms this intuition. So to recap, central bank's reaction function in an IT regime may have contributed, I think it did contribute, to the progressive loss in room for policy maneuver before the COVID-19 crisis. At each point in time, what central banks took as an exogenous real interest rate was, at least to some extent, the result of their own past actions. And ultimately, and this was a key concern that I had, this could raise the risk of a debt trap, that is, one in which interest rates decline, debt levels progressively ratchet up over successive cycles, which makes it harder to raise interest rates without causing damage to the economy. All the more so if we take into account what's happening to the public sector, not just private sector debt, but public sector debt. I think governments needed no particular encouragement to increase deficits when interest rates were as low as they were. Now, it took a huge exogenous shock to jolt the system away from its path, at least temporarily. Now, to be sure, first central banks and governments had to consume further the room for policy maneuver. There was no alternative. But then the unexpected increase in inflation provoked a forceful monetary policy tightening. In the process, central banks did regain room for policy maneuver, but inevitably this was done at the expense of governments as they were raising interest rates against the background of higher debt. Now, the key question going forward is whether the interest rates will settle where they will settle, and once inflation will be brought back under control, as central banks are succeeding. If this analysis is correct, this will partly depend not just on exogenous factors, but also on the evolution of inflation targeting regimes themselves. Now, at this point, I'm sure many of you, or if not all of you, are asking, what about the evidence that R star is determined by fundamental slow-moving forces such as productivity growth, demographics, income distribution, and the like? I think my answer is threefold. And again, this is developed in some research that we have done with colleagues, although some other people are now making similar points. First of all, the previous analysis suggests that monetary policy can easily have a very persistent impact on real interest rates through its effect on the financial cycle and ultimately on the financial system. Now, for all intents and purposes, this is indistinguishable from an impact on R star. Second, empirical evidence is not as strong as normally believed. When data are allowed to speak, there is no systematic evidence of a link between the usual suspects that I mentioned earlier and real interest rates before the mid-1980s. Indeed, if the sample is extended back to, say, the 1870s across many countries, and also if one tries to take into account global factors, a robust relationship actually emerges with monetary policy regimes across time and countries. And finally, this suggests to me that the link between real interest rates and output at potential unstable inflation is not as tight as very often believed. Too many other factors come into play. For example, broader aspects of financial conditions and, I would add, nominal interest rates themselves. So the hypothesis here, and it is a hypothesis, is that a range of real policy rates can be broadly consistent with such outcomes, even over extended periods. Hence, the large confidence bands around estimates of R* may not be so much the reflection of the fact that a precise relationship is measured imprecisely, but that the relationship itself is imprecise, the relationship between real interest rates, output potential, and stable inflation. Now, if this analysis is correct, what does it suggest about for possible adjustments to inflation targeting frameworks? Any such adjustments would need to take into account a number of considerations, and here let me just mention 4. The first is that the framework needs to be robust to alternative possible economic environments. And I have the sense here that this was not always the case with recent adjustments in the frameworks. Now, arguably, in the years ahead, the world could be structurally more inflationary. If deglobalization continues, labor and firms could regain the pricing power that they had lost. Geopolitics, the green transition, and demographic trends could lead to more persistent headwinds. And high levels of public and likely private debt could generate incentives to inflate them away. But one cannot rule out a return to the pre-COVID environment. That is, inflation returning to pre-COVID rates rather quickly. And indeed, wage pressures, I think, have been remarkably subdued around the world, given the surprise increase in inflation and therefore in the price level that we saw. The importance of the second consideration is the importance of long policy horizons, and this cannot be stressed enough. Now, of course, long horizons have already been quite prominent in the context of price stability. Recall the temptation to boost output in the short term at the cost of inflation further down the road, the so-called timing consistency problem. But the financial cycle can raise even more insidious form of timing consistency, because the financial cycle is much longer than how the business cycle is traditionally, and let me stress, traditionally measured, the kind of filters that we use to estimate the business cycle. Indeed, by some estimates, is about twice as long. It is as if the emergence of the financial cycle had slowed economic time in relation to calendar time. That is, the economic forces that really matter, that matter most for all of us, take longer to play out. Now, in fact, if you apply similar filters to output as those that you apply to try and work out, estimate the financial cycle, then a medium-term business cycle emerges, which moves remarkably in sync with the financial cycle. The third consideration is the need to incorporate systematically the importance of safety margins or buffers in the conduct of policy. Economies operating without safety margins are vulnerable to both the inevitable next recession and to unexpected exogenous shocks, such as, for example, COVID. Now, in all walks of life, the need to retain safety margins is an explicit guide to action. Why should it be different with monetary policy? After all, if something is valuable, it should be worth paying a certain price for it. And finally, the fourth consideration, I think it is essential to have a realistic view about what monetary policy can and cannot deliver. As long as it is prepared to pay the price, monetary policy can prevent inflation from becoming entrenched. As long as it has fiscal backing, monetary policy can stabilize the financial system at times of stress, even when solvency concerns mount. This is the traditional lender of last resort, or increasingly market maker or buyer of last resort. And as long as prudential policy is supportive, monetary policy can help restrain financial imbalances and contain their damage. But monetary policy cannot, let me stress, cannot fine-tune inflation within basis points, and let alone economic activity within narrow ranges, nor can it be relied upon as a de facto engine of growth. When I see the financial industry and media razzmatazz surrounding policy decisions, I worry that we have long lost that sense of realism. And I see a dangerous and growing expectations gap developing between what monetary policy can deliver and what it is expected to deliver. This can seriously complicate policy and ultimately could even undermine central banks' independence and legitimacy. Now, these broad considerations have implications for objectives and the strategies to pursue them. And here again, for symmetry, if you like, let me mention 4. First is that hardwiring a low inflation regime should remain a priority. I love the behavioral definition of price stability that first Volcker and then Greenspan gave. That is, an environment in which inflation does not materially influence people's behavior. So let me stress, the objective should be not so much to anchor inflation expectations, but to make those expectations irrelevant. This also means that raising current targets would be a bad idea. Quite apart from undermining central banks' credibility, it would endanger that environment, the low inflation environment, and hence also the self-stabilizing properties of inflation in that environment. Inflation would risk drifting out of the region of rational intention into that of sharp focus, and could then act as a more effective coordinating device for people's behavior, as the common factor behind price changes increases and they become more similar. Inflation becomes more representative of the individual price indices that matter for people, whether they are producers or whether they are consumers. And critically, this is one reason why transitions from low to high inflation regimes tend to be self-reinforcing. This coordinating device of inflation becomes more important. Second, a key adjustment would be greater tolerance than in the past for moderate, even if persistent shortfalls of inflation from narrowly defined targets. This would help retain precious room for policy maneuver, exploiting the self-stabilizing properties of inflation in low inflation regimes, and would allow central banks to take more systematically into account the longer-term damage caused by persistently low interest rates. Now, implementing such a strategy would require addressing what Feldstein and Rajan have called the deflation bogeyman, seeing deflation as a kind of red line that once it is crossed, self-reinforcing downward spirals follow in economic activity, or there is a depression trap. Now, let me stress, neither empirically nor conceptually is the link as strong as often believed. Third point, further thought should be given to how best to use the additional room for policy maneuver to tackle financial cycles. Now, I have no specific answers here, but just a general direction of travel. And that would involve lengthening the horizon as far as possible, upgrading the role of financial conditions, credit aggregates, and property prices among policy guides, and finally, analytically, moving from what is the typical standard shock propagation return to steady state paradigm of business cycles to one which sees them as endogenous and as possibly unstable, driven in particular by financial factors. And the fourth and final adjustment would be making some refinements designed to preserve flexibility and safety margins. One would be less reliance on forms of forward guidance that provide specific information about the future path of interest rate beyond the central bank's reaction function, which I think can unduly constrain central banks' nimbleness, unduly compress risk premia, and also therefore encourage risk-taking. And in addition, probably more importantly, putting a premium on exit strategies whenever central banks take exceptional measures to stabilize the system and the economy. Think in particular of the difficulties in reducing historically large and risky central bank balance sheets. I think a reasonable principle here would be central bank balance sheets that should remain as small and riskless as possible, subject, of course, to fulfilling central banks' mandates effectively. Now, except possibly for the need to hold FX reserves for precautionary purposes, balance sheets can be quite small. In my view, a central bank balance sheet should be elastic, ready to increase when circumstances require it, but not large. And given the economic and political economic cost of larger balance sheets, the initial size is a hindrance, it is not a plus. So what kind of regime do I have in mind? I think it's one where central banks keep a sharp focus on the medium term, seeking to ensure that the financial side of the economy, which it influences, the central bank influences, and through which it operates, monetary policy operates, does not end up derailing the economy through inflation or the financial instability, broadly defined. That is a regime in which central banks simply set the monetary preconditions for sustainable growth, but do not end up being relied upon as engines of that growth. A regime where the operational definition of the inflation target is consistent with that overarching objective, that is, low enough so that inflation does not materially influence agents' behavior, but flexible enough to allow the central bank to take into account the financial forces that can generate long-term damage. And a regime where the central bank's reaction function calls for forceful responses when inflation threatens to get out of control, because this threatens the self-stabilizing nature of the low inflation regime, but allows for greater tolerance for moderate, even if persistent, shortfalls of inflation from target. The so-called tried to deal with the so-called deflation bogeyman. So let me conclude with a couple of broader reflections. Now, looking ahead, I worry that the toughest challenges for monetary policies, and therefore for inflation targeting, are still to come. For one, the political environment is becoming less conducive to a stability-oriented monetary policy. There is pressure on central banks to take a short-term view, and the demands on them are growing. It is precisely in that environment that the institutional safeguards such as central bank independence become all the more precious, but they can only help up to a point. Moreover, I wouldn't take too much comfort from the recent rather painless reduction in inflation. I think this largely reflected extraordinary circumstances, the extraordinary post-COVID circumstances, and that the future fights of inflation against inflation are likely to involve bigger costs, as they did in the past, especially in a less globalized world, where firms and workers would regain pricing power, and offer greater resistance to the erosion in purchasing power or the compression of profit margins. In addition, and closely related, the sustainability of fiscal trajectories is a major threat. Probably it is the biggest long-term threat to macroeconomic and financial stability in the years ahead, as we also emphasized in the BIS annual economic report. Ultimately, this would of course represent a threat to the inflation targeting regime itself. Monetary and fiscal policy are joined at the hip, and there are clear limits to what monetary policy can do if fiscal policy is out of kilter. Both policies need to operate firmly within a certain region of stability, which is consistent with sustainable growth. Now, these threats, the threats to the global environment and the threats within that environment that are associated with fiscal policy, are likely to make the adjustments that I proposed before even less likely. But I think that the inflation targeting regime cannot afford to stay still. Inflation targeting does not represent the end of monetary policy history, as it were. It is just one, if exceptionally long, chapter in that history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudio. That was fantastic, and lots of food for thought. So we've got a full house here, and we're going to open it up to questions. We've got about a half an hour to take questions from the audience. And so let's see if we've got some hands. I know that the Reserve Bank is ready to go. Hands up, the usual suspects. David and then JF. Go right ahead. There's a mic coming around. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much.
David, just introduce yourself quickly.
Hi, I'm David. I'm an advisor to the governors at the SARB. So, Claudio, a lot of your speech was about the zone of low inflation, rational inattention, a situation where inflation doesn't have to materially concern people or enter into their decisions. I guess a very simple question, do you think a target of 3 to 6% achieves those objectives or not? Thanks.
JF? Claudio, do you want to take them one by one?
No.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Maybe it's up to you.
No, go ahead. It's up to you, really.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, let me take this one. If you look across the world, there are differences in the actual level of the target. Although there has been a certain convergence towards a target of roughly 2%. And for example, in the case of South Africa, we know the target is what you mentioned earlier. It's considerably higher. It actually tends to be pretty much at the high end of, if not at the highest end of the target across emerging market economies. Now, my sense is that target does not quite give you sufficient confidence in inflation being irrelevant. I mean, it cannot be irrelevant if it is 5 or 6%. So that's the short answer. My answer would be, to the extent that you can, I think that it would be desirable to reduce that target. Of course, that raises questions about the speed, that raises questions about the cost, that raises questions about the preconditions. But I think that because of the mechanisms that I mentioned earlier, once you end up in a lower inflation regime, then that regime tends to be self-stabilizing and would make not just life easier for the central bank, people might not care about that, but definitely would make their life much easier. I'm talking about firms and households.
Great. Let's move to JF. Let's raise some more hands. We get a few more questions per round. Yes, any other hands? Jeff, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Jean-François Mercier from the research department at the SARB. Claudio, you did mention about the financial cycle. You mentioned about R-star. I mean, one issue about R-star, of course, it's equilibrium for the short-term risk-free interest rates. But we know that the financing costs in the economy are a function of riskier assets, you know, so how is the financial cycle and the risk appetite or the appetite that comes with it, should that influence R-star? You know, like for instance, if you have an environment where corporate yield spreads are tight, equity valuations are high, do you effectively keep your policy rate on equilibrium policy rate temporarily above what R-star would suggest to counterbalance, you know, or do you take a lead from the long-term interest rates? Because if you take a lead from the long-term interest rates as to where your R-star might be, those compressed risk premium might entice you to cut interest rates and then add to the financial stimulus. So should you instead weigh against it or not? You know, but doesn't it also rekindle the old debate, which was quite prevalent 10 or 15 years ago, as to whether what was the best way to lean against this excess in the financial cycles? You know, would you use monetary policy or would you rather use macroprudential tools? I remember the Riksbank was quite involved in that at the time. Yes.
Well, many questions there. Which way R-star moves is actually partly a definition. It's partly a definitional question. Do you consider R-star as including or excluding the risk premium and so on? But leaving that aside, and also the horizon over which you're thinking of R-star and whether it's shorter term, longer term, but leaving all of that aside, the answer to your question is yeah, if you actually see risk premia being particularly low, that is precisely a situation in which risk-taking is high, risks are building up. And therefore, all else equal, if you want to address that issue, if you want to try and move the economy closer to a kind of longer-term balance, longer-term sustainable expansions without risking financial problems, then the idea would be indeed to raise interest rates over or above your whatever estimate of R star you have, and that will very much depend on the model and the technique you're using to estimate R star. On the old and still, I think it hasn't gone away, debate about whether the role of monetary policy in all this vis-a-vis macroprudential policy. My view, from the very beginning, in fact, if you read the initial work that I was also doing with Andrew Crockett in 2000 and the speeches that he was giving, the idea was that you needed both. For a balanced and effective response to these very deep, very strong forces of the financial cycle, you needed both. You needed a strong macroprudential framework, and you also needed, in addition to a strong prudential framework, microprudential framework generally, and you needed a monetary policy response. And the underlying reason for this is precisely the strength of the financial cycle. And it's the fact that, remember, after all, regulation, prudential regulation is based on, it's related to accounting valuations and market valuations, which in the end, in fact, so market prices will directly or indirectly infect those valuations in many different ways. So at the end of the day, basing purely a response on macroprudential policy is unlikely to do the job, because the whole building on which you are operating, on which a macroprudential policy operates, or the building, the ground on which macroprudential policy is operating may end up being quicksand. And by contrast, monetary policy sets the universal price of leverage in a particular currency area. So it is can be quite powerful. Monetary policy is, if you ask me, I think that the impact of monetary policy on the financial system, on financial conditions, ends up being rather stronger and more direct than the impact that it has on inflation as such. It doesn't mean that you can easily calibrate it, but I think that is probably a reality. So, following on this, certain irony here, because before after the great financial crisis struck, I remember very much the debates within the central banking community. And there were a number of central banks that were becoming actually quite, I would say, sympathetic to the idea of using monetary policy to deal with these financial imbalances. But then, macroprudential frameworks were put in place. But by the way, frameworks that were very controversial before the great financial crisis. But when these frameworks were put in place, then there was a strong, I would say, a natural temptation to say, well, now that we have these macroprudential frameworks in place, we can go back to business as usual. But I don't think that going back to business as usual is sufficient for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So that there is a role for monetary policy, and it is a role not for, I would say, surprise adjustments that take place only when you see that the problems are completely getting out of hand. Because if what you do are purely discretionary adjustments at that point, then it's going to be too late. What we need to do, what central banks need to do, is to try and incorporate in a more systematic way, in their systematic policy response, the importance of these factors.
Great, thanks, Claudio. So lots of focus, I think, on calibrating a pretty complex environment with different moving parts, macroprudential, monetary, and fiscal, perhaps. Witness, question.
Thank you, Borio. My name is Witness from the Research Department of the Reserve Bank. So I think the first is probably a clarification. When you spoke of long policy horizons, I'm not sure I fully got you when you spoke about creating systematic buffers. So I'm just trying to understand whether by this you mean, for example, if you can get maybe inflation below target for some time, that will give you buffers, or what exactly do you mean by creating buffers? And then the second thing is to do with your discussion of R-star and its drivers. You seem to be sort of pushing back quite a bit on what we have taken as sort of gospel in terms of what drives R-star. So do you see this as maybe, and also, I mean, just to put in a point on the table, in recent sort of years, we haven't had central bankers paying or saying much about R-star anyway. Since the pandemic, I think there's been some sort of moving away from that discussion for obvious reasons, maybe that is very uncertain. But do you see this as maybe a new way of thinking about R-star that maybe it's not as central to what central banks should be doing? Is that the right way to read what you're saying? Thank you.
Okay, so, thank you for the question, especially when one is asked to clarify points. On the buffers, no, by buffer I simply meant, quite apart from any buffers that you can have on the prudential side, which is another issue. But obviously you need buffers there, and you need buffers in fiscal policy as well. On the monetary policy, it's simply the way that is operationalized in the discussion in my presentation is in two ways. One is basically to say, don't reduce interest rates too much. Have greater tolerance for inflation deviations on the low side, because those deviations tend to be self-stabilizing. You're not gonna. There is no red line that if you cross it, the economy is going to fall apart. I mean, just to give you an example. I mean, first of all, please do look at the data, and there are a number of references in my written presentation. But please, I would strongly encourage you to look at the data and see how strong or how weak indeed the link is between falling prices and output weakness. I would say that in a well-functioning capitalist economy in which you have productivity growth, in which you have competitive pressures, in which you have financial innovation, real innovation, having falling prices could be part, in some circumstances, could even be part of the physiology of a well-functioning capitalist economy, as opposed to being part of the pathology of that economy. So I think we need to revisit this, at least conceptually, this issue, in the light of the empirical data, in the light of the data, empirical evidence. So that's what I mean. One aspect of the buffer, interest rates. Don't rush to get interest rates to zero too quickly, especially on the belief that, say, R-star is negative. I mean, I cannot imagine that an economy can have a negative R-star for long. How can you allocate capital effectively in such an economy? So that's one point. The second point is central bank balance sheets. And this has been a particular issue for advanced economies, less for emerging market economies, because in emerging market economies, yes, of course, they may have large balance sheets for partly because of foreign exchange reserve holdings that have a more precautionary role, but they have not used actively monetary policy to, or if you like, balance sheet policy and domestic currency assets in order to set the stance of policy, and for very good reasons. So the idea there is that the central bank should rely less on these instruments and have smaller and less risky balance sheets, so that when the need arises, in order to stabilize the economy under very, very stringent conditions, they can increase them. But then always with a view, with having a clear exit strategy to get back to where they were before, once the conditions return have become more normal. I think one of the key problems that we have seen with the balance sheets of central banks in advanced economies that have resorted strongly to these policies is that it's proven extremely difficult to reduce them afterwards. And one reason for that was that exit strategies were not properly articulated at the time when they were introduced. And one reason for that is that I think the cost of such large balance sheets was underestimated. So that's the question on the buffer. On our star itself and its relevance in policy, this has waxed and waned, if you like. Before the great financial crisis, actually, the discussion of our star, I remember at the BIS and in central bank meetings, was not really that sort of prominent. Of course, our star was there in the background, but it was not, because you have no alternative once you move away from nominal anchors and you use what is in effect a real interest rate as the anchor, of course, anchored also by the inflation, but in terms of the instruments, it's a real interest rate. It's not a nominal quantity. So you have, if you don't have monetary aggregates, if you don't have credit aggregates, if you don't have an exchange rate, well, the only thing that you can have is an interest rate. And if you believe that it's real interest rates that really matter for the economy as opposed to nominal interest rate, you end up in this rather paradoxical situation in which the variable that the central bank uses as an anchor, or in terms of implementing its policies, a real variable is not a nominal variable. It's only the objective which is a nominal variable. So when after post-GFC, interest rates were very, very low. So you wanted also to try and justify why interest rates were extraordinarily low, even in negative in nominal terms, and our star was a useful communication device. Afterwards, when inflation went up, some of the discussion moved away from our star. Central banks became a little bit more, in their public communication, more fuzzy about a star. We're trying to reduce the weight on this concept. But at some point, again, if you don't have a nominal anchor, you will need to say something about where you expect interest rates to settle. And given your inflation objective, that is bound to be a statement also about our star. So I don't think you can fully move away from it within an inflation targeting regime in which you don't have any other nominal anchors.
Claudio, thank you very much. Let's open it for one last round of questions. George, and I don't know your name, but please, you'll go second. Let's do both questions. We got 3 hands up. Okay. So we'll do George, this lady, and then Andrea at the end. Let's take all 3, Claudio, if you don't mind, in a row.
Yes.
Okay. George, go ahead.
If my memory, if I manage, you may have to remind me.
That's fine.
Thank you, Claudio, and thank you for the opportunity.
We'll keep the questions short.
Short, yeah. We live in an interesting country where we're struggling to pass a budget, and where decades of weak gross fixed capital formation, one could argue, has left us in an unenviable position of having an economy that's not as efficient as it should be. The result is obviously potentially that we carry high levels of inflation. Now, in an environment where we're targeting lower inflation, and by answer to your first question, you indicated that would be preferable, and many in this room would share that view. Is the cost of getting us down to that lower level of inflation, given the inefficiencies that exist and are embedded in this economy, those are obviously going to be higher. In your studies and in your views, have you come across some work that we can read up on that would give us a sense that even though we have those inefficiencies, that targeting lower inflation is still preferable over the long term? Thanks, George. And then here, yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Kanyisa Pika. I'm from APSAP Women in Focus. And Prof, you spoke about a growing pressure for central banks to have a broader scope. And my question to you is really around lessons for the future, with inflation targeting in its core, not necessarily it's a gender-neutral policy, but it does have different outcomes for men and women. And in South Africa, there's a growing household that is headed by females and fewer female firms that have access to markets and capital. So in your experience or your conversations, how can we then, while using inflation target at a lower rate, be able to benefit some of these outcomes for our, well, I suppose our situation for
Thanks.
women?
Thank you. Andrea?
Thank you, Claudio. This is Andrea Macia from RMB Morgan Stanley Research. So 2 questions. The first one, I guess, relates somewhat to George's question initially around costs. And I was wondering, what is the thinking around asymmetric costs of choosing a lower target, or a too low target, versus a target that is perhaps not ambitious enough? You know, is that cost sort of asymmetric if you choose something too ambitious versus not? And then secondly, perhaps maybe a bit more empirical, those countries that have decided to reduce their targets, do they typically do so in a stepwise fashion towards the new target, or do they just decide to go cold turkey and then manage the monetary policy response from there? Thank you.
Thanks. Let's take one last one. Rudy Steinbach. And then we're going to call it there. Go ahead, Rudy.
Thank you, Claudio. I'm Rudy Steinbach from the South African Reserve Bank, and thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. So my question is about this low inflation regime where wages and prices then become, well, at least loosely linked, and that relationship breaks down. And then the central bank would have the luxury to tolerate deviations from inflation where above or below the target. How do you see that this regime evolve in the context of a small, open, emerging market like South Africa, where our policy is often tied to the advanced economy policy cycle, and especially the US? So domestic policy loses some of its autonomy, and that's often through the financial account, exchange rate channel, and then the exchange rate in itself then becomes a source of inflationary pressure. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rudy. Claudio, if you need a prompt, I can remind you. Go for it.
Okay, so I guess I'll try to be also very short, given that I don't know exactly how much time we have. But the first, let me take the 2 questions. There are 2 questions that were closely related that had to do with the cost of bringing inflation down and so on, and how to do it. I would say that countries typically have done it in I think, a stepwise fashion, but that depends very much on the initial level from which you start. In order to reduce the costs, and in order to try and bring this about, there are different ways in which you could do it. One way to reduce the costs is basically to follow what at some point was mentioned in the context of the United States, which was this opportunistic disinflation. So that whenever there are gains, you try to lock in those gains, and you keep inflation low, as opposed to just bring it down regardless of the initial conditions. So try and have the environment, have the economic environment work for you in bringing it down. Another way of, in terms of actually taking specific measures in order to reduce the costs, one possibility would be to work hard in those areas of the economy where you have administered prices, or if you like, rather rigid nominal wage contracts. I don't know exactly how the thing works in particular with respect to wages in your country. But for example, when it comes to administered prices, I mean, if you can try and work with the government to reduce the rigidities that may be there, that would be would be a useful approach. When it comes to wages, one could imagine situations in which you could try and agree, if you have a centralized system, you could try and agree with wage earners, some kind of particular target in wage reductions, for example, in the public sector, and then basically say, well, yeah, with the condition that if actually inflation turns out to be considerably higher than what we had expected, we might still compensate you. But effectively, the idea would be, and this is just off the top of my head, it's just something to consider, try to be very, very tough in terms of the objective, particularly in a context in which the conditions may be favorable, and but give some assurance to the wage earners, and if things turn out to be different from what you had expected, you would provide some compensation. That might induce them to adopt a lower wage, nominal wage trajectory. There was a question about asymmetric costs. Let me be clear about the reaction function that I have in mind. The reaction function that I have in mind in terms of flexibility is not actually symmetric, in the sense that because the nature of inflation, there is no basically sort of ceiling to how far prices can go up. But prices, when they go down, they typically go down very gradually for some of the rigidities that we have in the system. My preference would be to respond strongly to upward deviations of inflation from objective, especially if you have a history of high inflation, but to be more relaxed when you have shortfalls of inflation from target. Remember, I mean, after all, you had in the older days countries like even the ECB as a central bank, whose objective was inflation below a certain number. On the understanding that deflation was not going to be a disruptive, costly deflation, was unlikely to be an issue. And if you ask me personally, I think that some reconsideration of that type of objective, I wouldn't be particularly uncomfortable about it. But leaving that aside, what I'm just saying is you can have a symmetric objective, but you can have a somewhat asymmetric reaction function around that objective.
Claudio, about 2 minutes. Okay.
Okay, then.
Thanks.
Well, let me then stop here. I mean, no, there was a question, but unfortunately, it's not that I don't remember, is that I couldn't quite hear it. For some reason, the communication got broken, and it had to do with gender, I think.
I think the question's really about distributional costs of inflation.
Can the central banks do something, or should the central banks do something specifically about gender? I would be quite reluctant to see that. I think that the central bank has it in its power, and I'm not talking about hiring processes, but I'm talking about their monetary policy decisions, has it in its power to set the preconditions for sustainable economic expansions, that is, trying to avoid that inflation and or the financial side of the economy doesn't get in the way. But I don't think that it can, within that broad objective, try to fine-tune and try to do more.
Thanks, Claudio. I think let's end it there. Thank you very much for taking the time to give us the keynote and to deal with a wide range of questions. It's really kind of you. We're going to move on quite quickly now to the next panel. So thanks. And if people need a quick break, please
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudio.